The blood on her hands was still warm when Jack Thornton first saw her, kneeling in the tall grass with her skirts spread around her like a pool of faded calico, her fingers working gentle but sure over a calf's torn leg, while the mother cow lowed anxiously nearby. He had been riding the northern fence line of the Double R Ranch for 3 days straight, checking for breaks and rustlers, and he was bone-tired, dust-covered, and in no mood for company. But something about the sight of this woman, alone on the open prairie in the late afternoon sun, made him rein in his horse and watch. She had not heard him approach over the sound of the wind moving through the grass, and he took advantage of that moment to study her. Dark hair escaped from a bun at the nape of her neck, curling in the humidity. Her face was turned down in concentration, and even from 20 feet away he could see the furrow between her brows as she worked. She was humming something low and soft, probably to keep the calf calm, and her movements were practiced and confident. Jack cleared his throat, not wanting to startle her too badly, but she still jumped and turned, one hand going to her chest, while the other remained steady on the calf's shoulder. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, wide with surprise, but not fear. That struck him immediately. Most women alone on the prairie would show fear at the sight of a strange man, but this one just looked annoyed at the interruption. "Apologies, miss," Jack said, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you. Saw you from the rise and wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything is fine," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he could not quite place. Eastern, maybe, but with something else underneath. "Or it will be, if I can finish what I started here." Jack dismounted, leaving his horse ground-tied, and approached slowly. The calf was a few months old, red and white spotted, and its left front leg had a nasty gash running from knee to hoof. The woman had already cleaned it somehow, and she was in the process of applying what looked like a poultice made from plants he recognized as growing wild around these parts. Yarrow, maybe, and something else. "That is a bad wound," Jack observed, crouching down a few feet away so he could see better. "What happened?" "Barbed wire, I think," the woman said, not looking up from her work. "I found her about an hour ago, tangled in some old fencing that had been left out here, probably from when the homesteaders tried to settle this section 5 years back and gave up." Jack nodded. He knew about that attempt. 3 families had tried to farm this land, but the soil was too poor and the water too scarce. They had packed up and left in the middle of the night, leaving behind broken dreams and dangerous debris. "You know what you are doing?" he asked, watching her nimble fingers work. "I have done this before," she replied. Then, after a moment, she added, "My father was a veterinarian, in Boston, before." That word hung in the air between them. Before. It was a word everyone out here understood. Before the war, before the drought, before the loss, before the running. Everyone in the West had a before. Jack watched as she finished applying the poultice and then began wrapping the leg with strips of cloth she had torn from what looked like a petticoat. Her hands moved with the sureness of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and despite the rough conditions, her bandaging was neat and tight. "She will need to stay off it for a few days," the woman said, sitting back on her heels and wiping her forehead with the back of one hand, leaving a small smear of blood. "The mother will not leave her, so I will have to come back out here with food and water." "This is Double R land," Jack said. "I work for them. I can make sure someone checks on her." The woman looked at him properly for the first time, really looked at him, and Jack felt something shift in his chest. It was not just that she was pretty, though she was, in a sun-weathered, work-hardened way that he found infinitely more appealing than the painted ladies in town. It was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding that suggested she had seen suffering and chosen to fight against it rather than become hardened by it. "Thank you," she said simply. "That would be kind." Jack stood and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it, and he pulled her to her feet. She was tall for a woman, coming up nearly to his shoulder and solidly built, not delicate, strong. "Jack Thornton," he introduced himself, releasing her hand though part of him did not want to. "Eliza Monroe," she replied, gathering up her supplies and putting them back into a worn leather satchel. "I live about 3 miles east of here, with my aunt and uncle, the Brennan place." Jack knew it. Small operation, barely scraping by, but honest people. He had met Thomas Brennan a few times in town. Good man, but getting on in years and struggling with the arthritis that plagued so many out here. "Long walk back," Jack observed, noting that the sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon. "Can I offer you a ride?" Eliza looked at his horse, then at him, clearly weighing the propriety of accepting against the practicality of the situation. Practicality won. "That would be appreciated," she said. Jack swung up into the saddle first, then reached down and pulled her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's rump with the ease of someone familiar with riding, though he noticed she kept a careful distance between them, holding onto the back of the saddle rather than his waist. They rode in silence for the first mile, nothing but the sound of hoofbeats and wind and the distant call of a hawk. Jack was acutely aware of her presence behind him, the way her weight shifted as the horse moved, the faint scent of sage and something sweet, like honey, that seemed to emanate from her. "You have a healer's heart," he said finally, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. It was not his usual way, blurting things out, but something about her made him want to speak truths he usually kept buried. "I can see it in the way you worked with that calf. Gentle but sure, not everyone has that gift." He felt rather than saw her tense slightly behind him. "It is not always a gift," she said quietly. "Sometimes it is a burden." Jack wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to know her story, all the befores that had brought her here, but they were cresting the ridge that overlooked the Brennan place, and the moment passed. The Brennan homestead was humble but well maintained, a small house with a porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the left but still stood, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that showed signs of careful tending. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Jack could see a figure moving around inside through the window. He rode right up to the porch and dismounted, then helped Eliza down. She landed lightly and immediately put some distance between them, brushing dust from her skirts. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Thornton," she said formally, but there was warmth in her eyes. "Jack," he corrected. "Just Jack?" The front door opened and a woman in her 50s emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She had the same honey-colored eyes as Eliza, marking them as blood relatives. "Eliza, there you are," the woman said, relief evident in her voice. "I was starting to worry. You were gone much longer than usual." "I found a calf caught in old wire, Aunt Margaret," Eliza explained. "It took some time to treat her properly." Margaret's eyes moved to Jack, assessing him with the frank appraisal of a woman who had lived long enough to size up men quickly and accurately. "This is Jack Thornton," Eliza continued. "He works for the Double R and was kind enough to give me a ride home." "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," Jack said, removing his hat. "Thornton," Margaret said slowly, as if testing the name. "Thomas mentioned you, said you were honest, which is high praise from him." "Your husband is a good man," Jack replied. "Come in for supper," Margaret said, and it was less invitation than command. "It is not much, but it is hot, and you have done us a kindness bringing Eliza home safe." Jack should have declined. He still had 2 hours of riding to get back to the bunkhouse, and Cookie would have supper waiting. But he found himself nodding and following the women inside. The house was small but spotlessly clean, with simple furniture and little decoration beyond a few photographs and a sampler on the wall that read, "God grant us serenity." A fire burned in the hearth, and a pot of something that smelled delicious bubbled over it. A man sat in a chair near the fire, his hands gnarled with arthritis, his face lined but kind. "Thomas, this is Jack Thornton from the Double R," Margaret introduced. "He brought Eliza home, and I have invited him for supper." Thomas struggled to stand, and Jack quickly crossed the room. "Please, sir, do not get up on my account," he said. "Nonsense," Thomas replied, but his grimace of pain said otherwise. "A man greets a guest properly." They shook hands, Thomas's grip weak but determined, and then Margaret was shooing everyone to the table. It was a simple meal, rabbit stew with vegetables and fresh bread, but it was better than anything Cookie made, and Jack said so, which earned him a genuine smile from Margaret. The conversation over dinner was easy and comfortable. Thomas wanted to know about the condition of the range, whether the Double R had seen any rustler activity, what the boss thought about the new railroad spur they were talking about building. Jack answered honestly and found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around people. There was something about this family, about their simple honesty and warmth, that made him feel almost at home, and he had not felt that way in a very long time. Eliza was quiet during most of the meal, but Jack caught her watching him several times with those remarkable eyes, and each time she looked away quickly when their gazes met. He wanted to know what she was thinking, wanted to know everything about her actually, which was a strange and unfamiliar feeling. After supper, Thomas invited Jack to sit with him by the fire while the women cleaned up, despite Jack's protests that he should help. Margaret would not hear of it, so Jack found himself in the chair opposite Thomas, acutely aware of Eliza moving around the small room, the swish of her skirts, the soft humming she had been doing earlier with the calf. "Eliza is special," Thomas said quietly, watching Jack watch his niece. "She has been through more than any young woman should have to bear, but it has not hardened her. If anything, it made her more determined to ease suffering wherever she finds it." Jack wanted to ask what had happened, but it would have been improper, so he just nodded. "She came to us 2 years ago," Thomas continued, "after her parents died in a fire, lost everything, but she never complained, never asked for pity, just rolled up her sleeves and started helping. This place was falling apart before she came. Look at it now." Jack looked. He saw the mended curtains, the polished furniture, the carefully tended plants on the windowsill. He saw the work of someone who cared, who put love into the smallest details. "You are a lucky man to have her," Jack said. "We are blessed," Thomas agreed. "But she needs more than what we can give her here. She needs a future, a family of her own. She is 22 years old, and there are not many suitable men in these parts. The ones in town are either too old, too wild, or too poor to support a wife." Jack understood what Thomas was doing, and part of him bristled at the obvious matchmaking. But another part, a deeper part, whispered that maybe this was exactly what he had been looking for, without knowing it. "I should be going," Jack said, standing. "It is a long ride back, and I have an early start tomorrow." Thomas struggled to his feet again, and this time Jack led him. They shook hands once more, and then Eliza was there with Jack's hat, which he had left on a peg by the door. "Thank you for supper," Jack said to the room at large, but his eyes were on Eliza. "It was the finest meal I have had in longer than I can remember." "You are welcome any time," Margaret said warmly. Jack stepped out into the cool evening air and was surprised when Eliza followed him onto the porch, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "I wanted to thank you again," she said softly, so her voice would not carry back inside, "for helping with the calf and for bringing me home. You did not have to do either." "I wanted to," Jack said honestly. He settled his hat on his head and looked at her, really looked at her, memorizing the curve of her cheek in the lamplight spilling from the window, the way her hair curled at her temples, the strength and gentleness he saw in equal measure in her face. "Your uncle says you have been through a lot." "We all have," Eliza replied. "That is the price of living, I suppose. But I choose to believe that we can still find beauty in the world, still make things better where we can. That calf today, she has a chance now. Maybe that is small in the grand scheme of things, but it matters to her." "You have got a healer's heart," Jack said again, and this time he did not stop there. The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam, surprising him as much as her. "Come help mine." Eliza's eyes widened, and for a long moment she just stared at him. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, "What do you mean?" Jack had not planned this, had no pretty speech prepared, but he found himself speaking from a place of raw honesty he rarely accessed. "I mean that I have been walking around with a hole in my chest for 5 years now," he said, "ever since my wife and son died of fever. I thought it was just how life was going to be from now on, empty and gray and just going through the motions. But today, watching you with that calf, seeing the care you took, the tenderness, I felt something crack open inside me. Like maybe there was still a chance for something more than just existing." Eliza's hand came up to her throat, and he could see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. "I do not know you," she whispered. "No," Jack agreed, "but I would like to change that, if you are willing." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Eliza smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it felt like the sun breaking through clouds. "I would like that too," she said. Jack felt something unfurl in his chest, something that had been clenched tight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe deeply. He wanted to say more, to capture this moment in words, but the door opened behind Eliza and Margaret poked her head out. "Everything all right out here?" she asked, her eyes moving between them with sharp interest. "Yes, ma'am," Jack said quickly. "I was just leaving." "Will we see you again?" Margaret asked, and there was no subtlety in the question. "Yes, ma'am," Jack said, looking at Eliza. "If that would be all right." "Come for Sunday dinner," Margaret said decisively. "After church. We attend the service at the community hall in Miller's Creek." "I will be there," Jack promised. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat to both women, letting his eyes linger on Eliza for an extra moment. Then he turned his horse and rode off into the gathering darkness, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The next 5 days were the longest of Jack's life. He went through his duties on the ranch mechanically, his mind always drifting back to honey-colored eyes and gentle hands and a voice that was both strong and soft. He found himself making excuses to ride the northern fence line, checking on the calf Eliza had treated. The animal was healing well, the wound showing no signs of infection, already starting to close. He brought extra feed for the mother cow, making sure they were both well tended, and told himself it was just good ranching. But he knew the truth. It was a connection to Eliza, a way to feel close to her, even when she was miles away. Saturday night, he washed his good shirt twice, trying to get all the dust and sweat out of it. His bunkmate, a grizzled old cowhand named Charlie, watched with undisguised amusement. "Never seen you take such care with laundry before," Charlie observed, working a wad of tobacco in his cheek. "Must be a woman involved." "Mind your own business," Jack replied, but there was no heat in it. "About damn time," Charlie said, leaning back on his bunk. "You have been half dead for years now, boy. Need a good woman to bring you back to life." Jack did not respond, just kept scrubbing at a stubborn stain. But Charlie's words echoed his own thoughts. He did feel like he was coming back to life, like something frozen inside him was finally starting to thaw. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made a man grateful to be alive. Jack dressed carefully in his cleanest clothes, polished his boots until they shined, and even trimmed his beard, which had grown shaggy over the winter. When he looked at himself in the small mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes had light in them again. The community hall in Miller's Creek was packed when Jack arrived, families crowding onto rough-hewn benches, while Reverend Walsh prepared to deliver his sermon. Jack spotted the Brennans near the back and made his way over, his heart hammering in his chest, like he was a green kid again, instead of a 30-year-old man who had seen death and hardship, and just about everything else life could throw at him. Eliza looked up as he approached, and the smile that lit her face made every moment of the long week worth it. She was wearing a simple dress of pale blue, her hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, and she was without question the most beautiful thing Jack had ever seen. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly, sliding over to make room for him on the bench. "Miss Monroe," he replied, settling in beside her, acutely aware of the few inches of space between them, and the fact that her aunt and uncle were watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. The service was the usual mix of hymns and scripture and stern warnings about sin, but Jack barely heard a word of it. All his attention was focused on the woman beside him, the way she sang with unself-conscious joy, the way she bowed her head in prayer with genuine reverence, the way her hand rested on the bench between them, so close to his that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. After the service, as people milled about exchanging gossip and making plans for the week ahead, Jack found himself introduced to what seemed like half the county. Everyone wanted to know who the stranger with the Brennans was, and he could see the speculation in their eyes, the knowing looks passed between the older women. In a community this small, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the arrival of a potential suitor was major news. "Do not mind them," Eliza murmured as they finally escaped to where the horses were tied. "They mean well, mostly." "I do not mind," Jack said honestly. "Let them talk." The ride back to the Brennan place was pleasant, Jack riding alongside the wagon, while Thomas handled the reins, and the women chatted about various neighbors and their ailments. Apparently, Eliza had become something of an unofficial doctor for the area, treating everything from colic in babies to infected wounds in cowboys. People came from miles around when they heard Thomas Brennan's niece had a healing touch. Dinner was another simple but delicious meal, roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, and fresh bread with butter and honey. The conversation flowed easily, and Jack found himself talking about things he had not spoken of in years. His childhood in Missouri, his time in the war, though he kept the worst of it to himself, and how he had ended up in Montana Territory working cattle. "What about your family?" Margaret asked. "Are they still in Missouri?" Jack shook his head. "My parents died during the war. Illness, not battle. My sister married a shopkeeper and moved to Ohio. We write occasionally, but we are not close." "And your wife's people?" Margaret pressed gently. All gone, Jack said shortly, and the change in his tone made it clear he did not want to discuss it further. Eliza reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, just a whisper of contact, but it steadied him, brought him back from the dark places his mind sometimes went. After dinner, Eliza asked if Jack would like to see the garden, and he agreed eagerly, grateful for the chance to be alone with her. They walked through rows of emerging vegetables, early spring growth just starting to push through the earth, and Eliza explained her plans for the season, what she hoped to grow, how she was trying some new methods she had read about in a farmer's almanac. "You have done a lot for your aunt and uncle," Jack observed. "They took me in when I had nothing," Eliza replied. "Everything I had burned in the fire. My clothes, my mother's jewelry, my father's books and instruments. I arrived here with only the dress on my back and grief so heavy I could barely breathe. They gave me a home and asked nothing in return. This is the least I can do." They had reached the edge of the garden, where a small bench sat under a cottonwood tree. Eliza sat down, and Jack joined her, leaving a respectable distance between them, though every fiber of his being wanted to close that gap. "Tell me about them," Eliza said softly. "Your wife and son, if you want to." No one had asked Jack that in years. People avoided the subject, treating it like a wound that would reopen if examined. But Eliza asked like she genuinely wanted to know, like she could bear the weight of his grief, and so he found himself talking. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "We grew up together, married young. She was 16, I was 18. Everyone said we were too young, but we knew. You know how sometimes you just know?" He glanced at Eliza, and she nodded. "We had 5 good years together. Then Samuel came along, and that was the happiest I had ever been. He had her eyes, blue as a summer sky, and he laughed at everything. Everything was funny to him." Jack had to stop and swallow hard against the lump in his throat. "The fever came through town the summer he turned 2, he continued. "Took a third of the children, and plenty of adults too. Sarah went first, fighting to the end, and then Samuel 3 days later. I buried them on a hillside overlooking the river where we used to have picnics." "I am so sorry," Eliza said, and the sincerity in her voice broke something loose in Jack that had been dammed up for too long. Tears spilled down his cheeks, silent and unstoppable, and he did not try to hide them. Eliza moved closer and took his hand in both of hers, holding it firmly, grounding him. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, and the clucking of chickens and the wind in the cottonwood leaves. "My parents died on a Tuesday," Eliza said eventually. "We had a house in Boston, and my father had his practice on the ground floor. Someone came in the night seeking treatment, and my father went down to help. I was asleep upstairs. The man was drunk and knocked over a lamp. And by the time I woke up, the whole first floor was engulfed. My father tried to get my mother out, but the stairs collapsed. They died together, holding each other." "How did you escape?" Jack asked hoarsely. "I jumped from my bedroom window," Eliza said. "Broke my ankle, but I lived. I stood in the street in my nightgown and watched everything burn. All the neighbors came out, tried to help, but it was too late. I lost my parents, my home, my father's life's work, everything in one night. And the worst part was knowing that the man who caused it walked away without a scratch." "Did they catch him?" "They caught him," Eliza said, and there was steel in her voice. "He went to prison, but that does not bring anyone back. It does not rebuild what was lost." They sat in silence for a while longer, 2 wounded people who had somehow found each other in the vastness of the frontier, and Jack felt something settle in his soul. This woman understood. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to have the ground ripped out from under you, and to have to find a way to keep living anyway. They were kindred spirits, marked by tragedy, but not defeated by it. "I am glad you came today," Eliza said finally. "So am I," Jack replied. They walked back to the house, hand in hand, and if Margaret noticed and smiled knowingly when they came in, neither of them cared. Jack began coming to the Brennan place every Sunday after that, and soon added Wednesday evenings as well, telling himself it was not too forward since Thomas had extended an open invitation. The truth was, he could not stay away. Every moment away from Eliza felt wasted, and every moment with her felt like coming home. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together on tasks around the homestead, talking about everything and nothing, slowly learning each other's rhythms and quirks and preferences. Jack discovered that Eliza loved thunderstorms and hated dishonesty, that she could whistle like a man and had a surprisingly bawdy sense of humor that came out when she was comfortable. She learned that Jack was meticulous about his work, that he had a deep love for horses and a surprisingly good singing voice, that he went quiet when he was upset instead of lashing out. One Wednesday evening, about a month after they met, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Eliza said casually, "There is a dance in town on Saturday to celebrate the Millers' 50th wedding anniversary. Everyone will be there." Jack turned to look at her. "Is that an invitation, Miss Monroe?" Eliza's cheeks colored prettily. "I suppose it is, Mr. Thornton." "Then I accept," Jack said, grinning. "Though I should warn you, I am not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Eliza admitted, "but I think we can muddle through together." The dance was held in the community hall, which had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons by the town's ladies. A small group of musicians played fiddle and guitar in the corner, and long tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in attendance. It was the kind of community event that happened less and less as the frontier became more settled, and there was a bittersweet quality to the celebration, a recognition that an era was passing. Jack and Eliza danced 3 dances together before propriety demanded they dance with other people. Jack found himself partnered with various town women, all of whom took the opportunity to grill him about his intentions toward Eliza Monroe. He answered honestly, saying that he cared for her deeply and hoped to court her properly, which seemed to satisfy most of them. One old biddy named Mrs. Fitzgerald actually patted his cheek and told him Eliza needed a good strong man to take care of her, which made Jack bristle until he saw Eliza across the room, trying not to laugh. When they finally came back together for another dance, Jack pulled her a little closer than was strictly proper and said, "I am being interrogated." "So am I," Eliza replied, her eyes dancing with mirth. "Apparently we are the most interesting thing to happen in Miller's Creek in months." "What are you telling them?" "The truth," Eliza said, suddenly serious. "That you are a good man and I enjoy your company." "Just enjoy?" Jack asked, his heart hammering. Eliza looked up at him, and the vulnerability in her eyes made his breath catch. "More than enjoy," she admitted softly. "Much more." Jack wanted to kiss her right there in the middle of the dance floor, with half the town watching. But instead, he just tightened his grip on her waist and said, "Come outside with me." They slipped out into the cool evening air, walking away from the hall until the sounds of music and laughter faded to a pleasant background hum. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light, and the smell of sage was heavy on the breeze. "Eliza," Jack began, then stopped, not sure how to put into words what he was feeling. "I know we have not known each other long, just over a month, but I feel like I have known you my whole life, like I have been waiting for you without knowing it." "I feel the same way," Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not a rich man," Jack continued. "I work for wages and I live in a bunkhouse with 7 other men. I do not have much to offer beyond my word and my work ethic, but I can promise you this. If you will have me, I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to make you happy. I will be faithful and true, and I will do everything in my power to build a good life for us." Eliza's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" "I am courting you," Jack said firmly, "officially and properly. And when enough time has passed that no one can say we rushed into anything foolish, I am going to ask you to marry me. But I wanted you to know my intentions now, so there is no confusion." Eliza laughed, a sound of pure joy, and threw her arms around his neck. Jack caught her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, they were standing so close that he could count her eyelashes in the moonlight, could feel her breath on his face. "I am going to say yes," Eliza told him. "When you ask, just so there is no confusion." This time Jack did kiss her, a soft, gentle meeting of lips that sent electricity racing down his spine. She kissed him back with a sweetness that made his knees weak, her hands coming up to frame his face, holding him like he was precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers and marveled at how his entire life had changed in the space of a few weeks. They stayed outside talking for another hour, making plans and sharing dreams. Jack told her about his hope of one day having his own spread, just a small place with some cattle and horses, where he could work for himself instead of someone else. Eliza told him about wanting to continue helping people who needed medical care, especially women and children who often went without, because there were so few doctors on the frontier and many could not afford the ones that existed. "We could do both," Jack said thoughtfully. "A small ranch could support us, and you could continue your healing work. We would be partners in everything." "Partners," Eliza repeated, testing the word. "I like that." When they returned to the hall, they found Thomas and Margaret waiting with knowing smiles. Nothing was said, but Jack shook Thomas's hand with a firm grip and received a nod of approval that meant more than words. They were giving their blessing, and Jack felt a surge of gratitude for these good people who had taken a chance on him. Over the next 3 months, Jack and Eliza saw each other as often as possible. Jack got permission from his boss to take Sundays off, and he spent every one of them at the Brennan place helping with chores, eating Margaret's good cooking, and courting Eliza with a single-minded determination that amused his bunkmates and earned approving nods from the older hands. He brought her small gifts when he could afford them: a hair ribbon from the general store, a book of poetry he found in town, wildflowers picked on his rides across the range. She gave him a hand-knitted scarf for when the weather turned, a tin of cookies she had made specially, and once, memorably, a passionate kiss in the barn that left them both breathless and aching for more. But they were careful, always mindful of propriety, never alone in a way that could cause gossip or damage Eliza's reputation. It was a sweet torture, being so close to what he wanted but having to wait, and Jack found himself lying awake at night in his bunk, listening to the snores of the other men, and thinking about honey-colored eyes and gentle hands and a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. In late August, 5 months after they met, Jack went to see Thomas Brennan. It was a Tuesday evening, and he had ridden over after finishing his work for the day, his stomach in knots and his heart in his throat. Thomas was in the barn repairing a bridle, his arthritic hands moving slowly but surely through the familiar task. He looked up when Jack entered and smiled. "Evening, Jack. Eliza's up at the house, helping Margaret with the canning." "Actually, sir, I came to talk to you," Jack said, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. Thomas set down the bridle and gave Jack his full attention. "I think I know what this is about." "I love your niece," Jack said simply. "I want to marry her, build a life with her. I am asking for your permission and your blessing." "You have both," Thomas said without hesitation. "You are a good man, Jack Thornton. You have been honest with us from the start, and I have watched the way you treat Eliza, with respect and tenderness and genuine affection. That is all I could ask for her." Relief flooded through Jack so intensely that his knees almost buckled. "Thank you, sir. But I have one condition," Thomas continued, and Jack tensed. "Eliza has a gift for healing. It would be a shame to waste it. Whatever life you build together, make sure there is room for her to continue that work. She needs it, needs to feel useful and needed. It is part of who she is." "I would never ask her to be anything other than who she is," Jack promised. "I love her exactly as she is. Healing work and all." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Then you have my blessing. When are you planning to ask her?" "Tonight, if she will walk with me after supper." Thomas's eyes twinkled. "I think that can be arranged." Supper was an agony of anticipation. Jack barely tasted the food, too nervous to eat, and he caught Eliza looking at him with concern more than once. Finally, when the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, Jack cleared his throat. "Miss Monroe, would you do me the honor of taking a walk with me? It is a beautiful evening." "I would be delighted, Mr. Thornton," Eliza replied formally, but her eyes were bright with curiosity. They walked to their spot under the cottonwood tree, where they had shared so many conversations over the past months. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and the air was soft and warm. Jack led Eliza to the bench, and they sat down, his heart hammering so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "You are nervous," Eliza observed, taking his hand. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Jack said quickly. "Everything is right. That is what I want to talk to you about." He stood up and turned to face her, then dropped to one knee. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes going wide. "Eliza Monroe," Jack began, his voice only shaking a little. "5 months ago, I was a man going through the motions of living without really being alive. I had convinced myself that the best parts of my life were behind me, that all I had to look forward to was work and sleep and eventually death. Then I saw you kneeling in the grass with a wounded calf, your hands covered in blood and your face full of concentration, and something inside me woke up. You brought me back to life with your kindness and your strength and your healer's heart." Tears were streaming down Eliza's face now, but she was smiling. "I do not have a ring yet," Jack continued. "I wanted to ask you first, to make sure you would say yes before I spent my savings on something you might not want. But I promise you, if you agree to be my wife, I will get you the finest ring I can afford, and I promise that I will work every day to be the kind of man you deserve. I will love you with everything I have, protect you with my life, and honor you until my last breath. Will you marry me, Eliza? Will you be my wife and my partner and the other half of my heart?" "Yes," Eliza said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, Jack. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." Jack surged to his feet and caught her in his arms, lifting her up and spinning her around just like he had the night of the dance. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying at the same time, and the kiss they shared was full of promise and hope and a future bright with possibility. They walked back to the house hand in hand to share the news with Thomas and Margaret, who reacted with gratifying enthusiasm. Margaret cried and hugged them both, and Thomas broke out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted the engagement and made preliminary plans for the wedding, deciding on a date in early October, after the harvest was in, but before the weather turned too cold. "Where will you live?" Margaret asked practically. "The bunkhouse is no place for a married couple." "I have been saving," Jack said. "Not a lot, but enough for a down payment on a small piece of land. I have had my eye on a parcel about 10 miles west of here, on the creek. Good water, decent grazing, and a line shack that could be fixed up into a proper house. It would be small at first, but we could add on as we prospered." "That sounds perfect," Eliza said, squeezing his hand. The next 2 months were a whirlwind of activity. Jack gave notice to the Double R, though his boss asked him to stay on part-time to help with the fall roundup, which Jack agreed to since they needed the money. He put his savings down on the land he wanted and spent every spare moment working on the line shack, replacing the roof, chinking the gaps between logs, building a proper door, and shutters for the windows. Eliza and Margaret sewed like mad women, creating a simple but beautiful wedding dress and linens for the new house. The women of the community pitched in, some contributing furniture, others food for the wedding feast, everyone wanting to help the young couple get started. It was frontier community at its best, people taking care of their own. Jack went into town and spent a week's wages on a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet that reminded him of Eliza's lips. When he slipped it onto her finger one Sunday afternoon, she cried and told him it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The wedding took place on a brilliant October day, with the aspens turning gold on the hillsides and the air crisp with the promise of winter. The ceremony was held in the community hall, with Reverend Walsh officiating and what seemed like everyone in the county in attendance. Jack stood at the front in his best clothes, his hands shaking with nerves, and watched Eliza walk toward him on Thomas's arm. She looked like an angel in her simple white dress, her hair loose and flowing down her back, a crown of wildflowers on her head. She was smiling through her tears, and when she reached him and took his hands, Jack felt something fundamental click into place. This was right. This was meant to be. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for all their days. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife and told Jack he could kiss his bride, Jack did so with enthusiasm, dipping Eliza back in his arms while the crowd cheered and whistled. The celebration afterward was raucous and joyful, with dancing and eating and more toasts than Jack could count. Charlie, his old bunkmate, made a speech that was surprisingly touching, talking about how Jack had been a ghost of a man when he first met him, and how Eliza had brought him back to life. Margaret cried through the whole thing, and even Thomas had to wipe his eyes a few times. As the sun began to set, Jack and Eliza slipped away to cheers and good-natured ribbing, riding double on Jack's horse toward their new home. It was only 10 miles, but it felt like a journey to a whole new world, their world. The house was small, just 2 rooms really, but Eliza had spent the past week getting it ready, and when Jack carried her over the threshold, she gasped with delight. Candles flickered everywhere, casting a warm glow over the simple furniture and the quilt on the bed. A fire burned in the hearth, and someone, probably Margaret, had left a basket of food and a bottle of wine. "It is perfect," Eliza breathed. "You are perfect," Jack corrected, setting her down carefully. They stood in the center of their new home, married less than 8 hours, and looked at each other with a combination of love and desire and nervousness that made them both laugh. "I have no idea what I'm doing," Eliza admitted. "Neither do I," Jack said. "We will figure it out together." And they did, with tenderness and laughter and a few awkward moments that would become funny stories in years to come. They learned each other's bodies with the same care and patience they had learned each other's hearts, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as the candles guttered and died, both were certain they had found their forever. The first year of marriage was not easy. Despite all their planning and saving, money was tight, especially through the winter when work was scarce. Jack took whatever jobs he could find, from hauling freight to breaking horses, and Eliza continued her healing work, often accepting payment in eggs or vegetables or whatever people could spare. Some months they barely scraped by, eating beans and bread for weeks on end. But they never complained. They had each other, and that was enough. In the spring, things improved. Jack got a contract to supply beef to the Army fort 30 miles north, and he used the advance payment to buy a small herd of cattle. It was not much, just 20 head, but it was a start. Eliza planted a huge garden, utilizing everything her aunt had taught her, and by midsummer they had more vegetables than they could eat. She started preserving the excess, putting up jars of pickles and tomatoes and beans for the winter. Their neighbors, the Hutchinsons, had a daughter who went into early labor in July, and Eliza spent 2 days at their place, helping to deliver the baby, and then caring for both mother and infant until they were out of danger. The grateful family gave them a milk cow as payment, and suddenly they had fresh milk and butter and cheese, luxuries they had been doing without. Life settled into a rhythm. Jack worked from dawn to dusk, building the ranch one day at a time, while Eliza managed the house and garden and continued to help anyone who needed her healing skills. They were building something together, a life and a legacy, and the satisfaction of that work made even the hardest days bearable. In late September, Eliza came to Jack in the barn where he was mending tack and said quietly, "I need to tell you something." The serious tone of her voice made Jack look up immediately, his stomach clenching with worry. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Eliza said, and then she smiled, a radiant expression that made her glow. "I am pregnant." Jack dropped the bridle he was holding and just stared at her, his mind trying to process what she had just said. Pregnant. They were going to have a baby. "Jack," Eliza's smile faltered. "Say something." "A baby," Jack finally managed. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Eliza confirmed. Jack let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses and swept Eliza into his arms, spinning her around just like he had so many times before. "A baby! Eliza, this is wonderful. This is the best news. When? How are you feeling? Do you need to sit down? Should you be working so hard in the garden?" Eliza laughed and cupped his face in her hands. "I am fine, healthy and strong. The baby will come in April, I think. And yes, I can still work in the garden. Pregnant women have been doing hard work since the beginning of time, but Jack insisted on taking over the heavier chores anyway, and Eliza let him, amused by his protectiveness. As her belly grew over the winter, Jack became almost comically careful with her, treating her like she was made of glass. She finally had to sit him down and explain that she was not fragile, that pregnancy was a natural process, not an illness, and that he needed to let her do things, or she would go mad with boredom. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the baby, deciding to turn the small second room into a nursery, making lists of what they would need, and dreaming about the future. Jack built a cradle with his own hands, carving little horses into the headboard, and Eliza sewed tiny clothes until her fingers ached. In early April, on a day when the snow was finally starting to melt and the first green shoots were pushing through the earth, Eliza went into labor. Jack rode like the devil was chasing him to fetch Margaret, who came immediately with her midwife's supplies and calm competence. Thomas stayed behind to pray, he said, though Jack suspected he just did not want to be in the way. The labor was long, nearly 20 hours, and Jack paced outside the bedroom door like a caged animal, listening to Eliza's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Every instinct screamed at him to do something, fix something, make it better, but there was nothing he could do except wait and pray and trust that Margaret knew what she was doing. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard a new sound. A baby's cry, lusty and strong. Jack burst through the door without permission and found Eliza propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Margaret looked up with tears in her eyes and said, "Congratulations, Jack. You have a son." A son. Jack moved to the bed on legs that did not feel steady and looked down at the tiny red-faced creature in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were screwed shut as he wailed his displeasure at being born into the cold world. He was the most beautiful thing Jack had ever seen besides his mother. "Samuel," Eliza said softly, looking up at Jack. "If that is all right. I know it was your son's name, but I thought maybe it would honor his memory." Jack could not speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded and kissed Eliza's forehead, then very carefully touched one finger to the baby's tiny fist. Samuel's hand opened and closed around Jack's finger, gripping with surprising strength, and Jack felt something heal inside him that he had not realized was still broken. This was not a replacement for the son he lost. Nothing could replace that boy. But this was a new beginning, a chance to be a father again, and he was going to do everything in his power to be worthy of this gift. Margaret stayed for 3 days, helping Eliza learn to nurse and caring for both mother and baby, while Jack stumbled around in a daze of joy and terror. Being responsible for something so tiny and fragile was terrifying, but also exhilarating. Every sound the baby made sent Jack running to check on him, until Eliza finally told him, with exasperation and love, that he needed to relax or he was going to drive them both crazy. Thomas came to visit once Eliza was up and around, bringing gifts from the community and his own proud tears. He held his great-nephew with the careful reverence of a man who understands how precious and fleeting life is, and when he handed the baby back to Eliza, he told Jack quietly that he had done well, that this was a good family he was building. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and small triumphs. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, Jack adding to the herd whenever he could afford it, building a proper barn and expanding the house. Eliza's healing practice grew as well, her reputation spreading throughout the region. People came from 50 miles away to seek her help, and she turned no one away, no matter how late the hour or how poor they were. In the spring when Samuel was 2, Eliza became pregnant again, and in January she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Jack's first wife. Jack had worried that it might be painful to use that name, but instead it felt right, a way of honoring the past while embracing the future. Little Sarah had her mother's honey-colored eyes, and a disposition as sunny as a summer day. 2 years later came another son, William, and then 2 years after that, twin girls, Grace and Hope. The house that had seemed so small when it was just the two of them was bursting at the seams with children and noise and laughter. Jack added on twice, building more bedrooms and a larger kitchen, until their home was the biggest for miles around. Money was still tight, especially with 5 children to feed and clothe, but they managed. The ranch provided beef, and the garden provided vegetables, and Eliza's healing work brought in whatever else they needed. They were not rich by any measure, but they were prosperous in the ways that mattered. They had land and family and love, and that was more than many people in the West could say. Samuel grew into a serious child with his father's work ethic and his mother's compassionate heart. By the time he was 8, he was helping with the cattle and starting to learn everything Jack could teach him about ranching. Sarah was the artist of the family, always drawing or singing, bringing beauty into their rough frontier life. William was the wild one, constantly getting into scrapes and adventures, while the twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language only they understood. Eliza moved through her days with grace and efficiency, somehow managing to care for 5 children, run a household, maintain her healing practice, and still find time to sit with Jack on the porch in the evenings, their hands linked, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. Those moments of quiet connection sustained them through the hard times, the years when drought threatened the cattle, or illness swept through the children, or money was so tight they did not know how they would make it through the winter. They weathered it all together, partners in the truest sense of the word. Jack never made a major decision without consulting Eliza, and she did the same. They argued sometimes, both being strong-willed people with firm opinions. But they always worked through it, never going to bed angry, always remembering that they were on the same side. When Samuel was 10, a scarlet fever epidemic swept through the region. Despite Eliza's best efforts, many children died, and for a terrifying week, it looked like William might be one of them. Eliza barely slept, nursing her son day and night, trying every treatment she knew. Jack took over everything else, caring for the other children and the ranch, and somehow keeping everything running, while his heart was breaking with fear. William pulled through, thin and weak but alive, and the whole family wept with relief. That experience changed something in Eliza. She became even more determined to expand her medical knowledge, sending away for books and journals, corresponding with doctors back east, constantly learning and improving. She started teaching some of the local women basic medical care, training them to help in emergencies when she could not get there in time. The community started calling her Doc Eliza, and the name stuck. She never had formal training, no medical degree hanging on the wall, but she had something more valuable: experience and instinct and a genuine desire to help. People trusted her with their lives and the lives of their children, and she carried that responsibility with humility and grace. Jack watched his wife evolve over the years, from the young woman he had found tending a wounded calf into a pillar of the community, respected and admired by everyone who knew her. He was proud of her beyond measure and told her so often, wanting her to know that he saw her and valued her, not just as his wife and the mother of his children, but as a person with her own gifts and calling. Their 20th wedding anniversary fell on a beautiful October day, with the aspens gold on the hillsides, just like on their wedding day. The children, now ranging in age from 18 to 8, had planned a surprise party, inviting everyone from miles around. Jack and Eliza came home from checking on a sick neighbor to find their yard full of wagons and their house full of people, everyone shouting surprise and congratulations. There was food and music and dancing, and speeches from friends and neighbors about how much Jack and Eliza meant to the community. Thomas, now in his 80s and very frail, stood with Margaret's help and told the story of the first time Jack had come to their house, how he had seen immediately that this was a good man who would love and care for Eliza the way she deserved. Margaret added her own memories, getting everyone laughing with tales of the early days of the courtship. As the sun began to set and people started heading home, Jack and Eliza slipped away to their spot under the cottonwood tree. The bench they had courted on was still there, weathered but sturdy, and they sat down together, Jack's arm around Eliza's shoulders, her head resting on his chest. 20 years, Eliza said softly. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Best 20 years of my life, Jack replied, kissing the top of her head. Best decision I ever made, asking you to marry me. Best decision I ever made, saying yes, Eliza countered. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one, listening to the sounds of their children laughing in the house. And Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. His first life, with Sarah and little Samuel, had been cut short by tragedy. He had thought that was the end of happiness for him. But then he had found Eliza, or maybe she had found him, and she had given him a second chance at everything. A second chance at love, at family, at building something meaningful. She had healed his heart just like she healed everyone who came to her for help, and he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for that gift. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "You," Jack said honestly. "How lucky I am. How you saved me in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Eliza said. "I was drowning in grief and duty when we met, going through the motions, but not really living. You reminded me that it was okay to want more, to reach for happiness again. We saved each other." "Partners," Jack said, echoing the word Eliza had used so many years ago on the night he proposed. "Partners," Eliza agreed, and sealed it with a kiss. The years continued to roll by, bringing the joys and sorrows that are part of every life. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at 85, and Margaret followed him just 6 months later, dying of what the doctor said was a broken heart. Jack and Eliza mourned them deeply, but took comfort in the fact that they had lived long lives and died, knowing they were loved. Samuel grew into a fine young man and fell in love with a neighboring rancher's daughter, a spirited girl named Louisa who could ride and rope as well as any man. They married when Samuel was 20, and Jack signed over a portion of the ranch to them, helping them build a house on the far corner of the property. Within 2 years, Jack and Eliza were grandparents to a boisterous grandson named Thomas, named for his great-great-uncle. Sarah surprised everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to go back east to study art. It was an unheard of thing for a frontier girl to do, but Jack and Eliza supported her, using their savings to send her to a women's college in Boston. She wrote faithfully every week, filling her letters with descriptions of museums and galleries and the paintings she was creating. She eventually married a professor, a kind man who appreciated her talent, and they settled in Philadelphia, where Sarah became a successful portraitist. William, true to his wild nature, became a deputy marshal, chasing outlaws across the territory and giving his parents regular heart attacks with his dangerous work. But he was good at it, and he loved it, and eventually he settled down with a saloon owner's daughter and had 4 boys of his own, each one as wild as his father. The twins, Grace and Hope, stayed close to home, both marrying local boys and settling within 5 miles of the original ranch. They gave Jack and Eliza a combined 8 more grandchildren, and Sunday dinners became raucous affairs with 3 generations crowded around the table. Through it all, Jack and Eliza remained the center, the foundation that everything else was built on. They aged together, silver creeping into their hair, lines deepening on their faces, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by shared experiences and mutual respect and the deep comfort of truly knowing another person. On their 30th anniversary, Jack took Eliza on a trip to Denver, their first real vacation in all their years together. They stayed in a hotel with actual room service, ate in fancy restaurants, and went to the theater. It was wonderful and exotic and completely unlike their normal life, but after 3 days they both admitted they were homesick for the ranch and their family. On the train ride home, Eliza took Jack's hand and said, "Thank you for this, for everything, for giving me a life beyond what I ever imagined possible." "Thank you for healing my heart," Jack replied, the words as true now as they had been that first night on the Brennan's porch. "Thank you for being my partner in everything." They returned home to find that Samuel and Louisa had organized a family reunion, with all 5 children and their spouses and all 13 grandchildren crowded into the house and spilling out into the yard. The noise was deafening and the chaos was absolute, and Jack and Eliza would not have changed a thing about it. As Jack looked around at the family they had created, the legacy they were leaving, he thought back to that afternoon, 30 years ago, when he had crested a rise and seen a woman kneeling in the grass with a wounded calf. He had been a broken man then, barely holding himself together, just going through the motions of living, and she had healed him, not with medicine or bandages, but with love and partnership, and the patient belief that he was worth saving. "What are you smiling about?" Eliza asked, coming to stand beside him with a glass of lemonade in each hand. "Just remembering," Jack said, taking one of the glasses. "That day I found you with the calf. Best day of my life." "Second best," Eliza corrected with a smile. "The best was when you married me." Jack laughed and pulled her close, kissing her temple. "You are right, as usual." They stood together watching their family, hands linked like always, and Jack sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had led him to that prairie that day. He had been looking for fence breaks and rustlers, but what he had found was infinitely more valuable. He had found home. He had found love. He had found his healer. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall, and fall back to winter again. Jack and Eliza moved through them together, their steps a little slower each year, but their spirits undimmed. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and Eliza trained several of her granddaughters in healing arts, passing down her knowledge to another generation. When Jack was 65, he decided it was time to officially retire, turning the daily operations of the ranch over to Samuel completely. He and Eliza moved into a smaller house they built near the creek, a cozy place with a big porch and a view of the mountains. They spent their days doing what they pleased, Jack fishing and working in the wood shop he had built, Eliza tending her extensive herb garden and still seeing patients occasionally when needed. It was a peaceful time, a reward for decades of hard work. They had earned their rest, and they enjoyed it fully, finding joy in simple things like morning coffee on the porch, afternoon naps in the sun, and evening walks along the creek where Jack had first brought Eliza as a bride all those years ago. On a warm summer evening when Jack was 72 and Eliza was 69, they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset paint the sky in glorious colors. Jack's health had been failing for the past year, his heart giving him trouble, and they both knew he did not have much time left. but there was no fear in their acceptance, only peace. They had lived full lives, raised good children, and loved each other well. What more could anyone ask for? "I am not afraid," Jack said quietly, knowing Eliza would understand what he meant. "I know," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Neither am I. We have had a good run, Jack Thornton." "The best," Jack agreed. "No regrets." "None," Eliza confirmed. "Well, maybe one. I wish we had more time." "We have had 47 years," Jack pointed out. "That is more than many people get, and I have loved you every single day of those years." "And I have loved you," Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. "From that first afternoon when you told me I had a healer's heart. You saw me, really saw me, and you asked me to help heal yours. It was the greatest honor of my life." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars came out, holding hands like they had done thousands of times before. Jack felt his heart laboring in his chest, the old ticker finally giving up after 7 decades of faithful service, and he was ready. He had done what he set out to do. He had built a good life, raised good children, and loved a good woman. That was enough. That was more than enough. "Eliza," he said softly. "I am here," she replied, moving closer, cradling his head against her shoulder. "Thank you," Jack whispered, "for everything, for healing me, for loving me, for being my partner." "Always," Eliza said through her tears, "always your partner." Jack closed his eyes and let himself drift, surrounded by love and peace and the scent of sage on the evening breeze. His last thought was that he was the luckiest man who ever lived, and his last sensation was Eliza's hand in his, warm and steady, just like it had been for 47 years. He slipped away so gently that at first Eliza did not realize he was gone. She sat holding him as the stars wheeled overhead, saying goodbye in her heart to the man who had given her everything. Finally, as the moon rose full and bright, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Until we meet again, my love." She sat with him until Samuel came looking for them at dawn, his face crumpling when he saw and understood. He helped his mother inside and sent for the rest of the family, and by afternoon, the house was full of children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, all of them mourning the patriarch they had loved. They buried Jack on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains he had loved, and the creek where he had built his first home with Eliza. The whole county came to the funeral, testament to the respect Jack had earned over his lifetime. Samuel gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he talked about his father's strength and kindness and unwavering love for his family. Eliza stood straight and dry, eyed through the service, her grief private and deep. She had known this day was coming, had been preparing for it, but nothing could really prepare you for the loss of your other half. She felt incomplete, like she was missing a limb, and the world seemed dimmer without Jack's smile to brighten it. But she did not crumble. She was still Doc Eliza, still needed by her family and community, and she would not give up just because her heart was broken. Jack would not want that. He would want her to keep living, keep helping, keep being the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. So she did. She moved through her grief with grace, supported by her large and loving family, and slowly the sharp edges of loss dulled to a manageable ache. She continued her healing work, finding solace in helping others, and she spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather so they would never forget the kind of man he had been. 3 years after Jack's death, on a crisp October afternoon, Eliza was working in her herb garden when she felt a strange flutter in her chest. She straightened up slowly, one hand going to her heart, and smiled. She knew what this was. Her old heart, which had beat faithfully for 72 years, was ready to rest. She went inside and wrote quick letters to each of her children, telling them she loved them and was proud of them, and that they should not mourn too long. Then she lay down on the bed she had shared with Jack for so many years, closed her eyes, and let go. Samuel found her the next morning, peaceful and still, a slight smile on her face. In her hand was clutched an old, faded photograph from their wedding day, showing a young couple looking at each other with such love and hope that it made the heart ache. They buried Eliza next to Jack on the hillside, their graves side by side with a single stone marking both. The inscription read simply, "Jack and Eliza Thornton, partners, united in life, reunited in death." The ranch continued to prosper, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story that had begun with a cowboy and a healer meeting over a wounded calf. The house they had built was preserved and expanded, becoming the heart of a sprawling family compound. Great-great-grandchildren played in the creek where Jack and Eliza had courted, and every October the family gathered to celebrate the anniversary of that first meeting that had changed everything. The story of how Jack and Eliza met became family legend, told and retold at every gathering. How Jack had crested a rise and seen a woman tending a wounded calf with such care and tenderness that it had cracked open his frozen heart. How he had told her she had a healer's heart and asked her to come help heal his. How she had said yes, and in doing so had saved them both. It was a love story for the ages, proof that even in the hardest of times and the roughest of places, beauty and tenderness could flourish, that two broken people could find each other and build something strong and lasting. That healing was not just about medicine and bandages, but about love and partnership and the choice to keep fighting for each other, no matter what life threw at them. And on warm summer evenings, when the whole family gathered on the porch of the old house to watch the sun set over the mountains, the older generation would swear they could still feel Jack and Eliza's presence, still sense the love that had built this place and brought this family together. Some even claimed to see two figures walking hand in hand along the creek at dusk, though of course that was just fancy, just the imagination playing tricks in the fading light. Or maybe it was not. Maybe love like that never really dies. Maybe it lingers on in the places and people it touched, becoming part of the land itself. Maybe Jack and Eliza really were still there, still together, still walking hand in hand through the country they had built together, still being partners even in death like they had been in life. The ranch stands to this day, over 150 years after Jack Thornton first saw Eliza Monroe kneeling in the grass with a wounded calf. It is still in the family, still worked by descendants who carry Jack and Eliza's blood and their values. The land has been modernized, with trucks instead of horses and computers alongside the account books, but the heart of it remains the same. And somewhere, carved into the trunk of an old cottonwood tree near a creek, weathered almost to illegibility but still visible if you know where to look, are the initials J.T. and E.M. surrounded by a heart, put there by a young man courting the woman who would become his wife, his partner, his salvation. It is a small mark, insignificant to anyone who does not know the story, but to those who do, it is a testament, a reminder that love can heal even the deepest wounds. That partnership is built on choice and commitment, not just feeling, that every life, no matter how hard, contains the possibility of beauty and redemption. Jack Thornton found Eliza Monroe tending a wounded calf one afternoon in the spring of 1873. He told her she had a healer's heart and asked her to come help heal his. She said yes. And in that yes, both of their lives were forever changed, forever intertwined, forever made better and brighter and more meaningful than either could have imagined. That is their story. That is their legacy. And it endures, passed down through generations, a love story for the ages, proof that even in the wild and unforgiving West, two people could find each other and build something that would outlast them both, something that would ripple forward through time, touching lives not yet lived, inspiring hearts not yet born. They were just a cowboy and a healer, but they were also so much more. They were partners, lovers, friends, parents, grandparents. They were the foundation on which a dynasty was built. They were proof that broken things can be mended, that frozen hearts can thaw, that new beginnings are always possible no matter how old the pain. And if you ever find yourself in Montana territory, driving through vast stretches of grassland with mountains rising in the distance, look for a ranch with a weathered sign bearing the name Thornton. Pull in and ask to hear the story. Someone will tell you, with pride and love in their voice, about the day Jack found Eliza tending a wounded calf, and how he saw in her gentle hands and compassionate heart the salvation he had been searching for without knowing it. They will tell you how he asked her to heal his heart, and how she did, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through steady presence and unwavering partnership, through choosing him every day and being chosen in return, through building a life together one day, one decision, one act of love at a time. That is how healing happens. That is how love works. Not in lightning bolt moments, though those matter too, but in the slow accumulation of shared days and mutual support, and the choice to keep showing up for each other no matter what. Jack and Eliza understood that. They lived it. And in doing so, they created something that still stands, still matters, still inspires over a century after they walked this earth. Their story is our story. The universal human story of loss and healing, of finding connection in unexpected places, of building meaning from suffering. It is a story about second chances and new beginnings, about refusing to let tragedy have the final word, about believing that there is always room for more love, more hope, more life. So remember them. Remember Jack Thornton and Eliza Monroe. Remember the cowboy and the healer who found each other on a Montana prairie and built an empire of love that still stands today. Remember that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how frozen your heart, there is always the possibility of healing. There is always the chance that around the next corner, over the next rise, in the next unexpected moment, you will find your person, your partner, your healer. And when you do, have the courage to say yes. Have the bravery to ask for help with your wounded heart. Have the wisdom to recognize a gift when it is offered and the strength to nurture it into something that will outlast you both. That is what Jack and Eliza did. That is their legacy. And it is available to all of us if we are willing to be vulnerable enough to admit we need healing and brave enough to reach for it when it appears. Their story ends with two graves on a hillside, side by side, partners even in death. But it also does not end at all. It continues in every descendant who carries their blood, in every person who hears their story and is inspired by it, in every act of healing and love and partnership that ripples forward through time. Jack found Eliza tending a wounded calf. He told her she had a healer's heart and asked her to come help heal his. She said yes. And they lived happily ever after. Not perfectly, because life is never perfect, but, well, with love and purpose and the deep satisfaction of knowing they had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. That is their story. That is the end and the beginning and everything in between. And it is enough, more than enough. It is everything.